You ready, Nick? Let's get him.
It's gonna last, but God bless, it's lasted a long time for me, and I think it's really having to diversify my skill set. Working in television, really creating, not just writing. Right, like I wrote for the magazine as a journalist, but beyond that, like I've done so much stuff as a creative writer.
We're going to get into it.
Okay.
I'd like to, of course, ask your relationship with those who would be perceived as the faces, the administrative faces of the Source.
Mm-hmm.
David Mays, what was your relationship like while you was at the Source with Dave Mays?
I mean, my relationship with Dave while I was at the Source was okay. It was okay. That was my boss. But then it got to the point where there were things that the way they ran the company I didn't like. So, everyone is familiar with that story. I don't want to get into that too much because it's over and done with. But I think we didn't have like a strong relationship. You know what I mean? It was just really, that was my boss. People, a lot of people didn't really, I think, understand how things were run, right? So like it was hard, I just said this recently when it came to like the business and the editorial. It was like church and state, right? But they were involved in editorial. And I think that created problems at time. I think probably for me it was less problems than it was for all the editors that came before me.
Got it. Were you actively writing at the Source when Eminem came on the scene?
Yeah, I was. When he came on the scene before I even got to the Source. I think, when did Eminem first come out?
Probably like 98, 99.
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, he came on the scene before that. Then I got to the Source in 2000, and so yeah, I was writing.
So you covered him.
Yes, we covered Eminem.
What type of environment was it at the Source when Eminem came into hip hop?
Well, Eminem was an unsigned hype artist. So the Source, throughout his career before him and Benzino got into anything, the Source was very supportive of Eminem because he was an unsigned hype alum.
Right.
So we covered Eminem. I'm trying to think, did I write a review of any of his albums? I might have written one of the Eminem album reviews. I cannot remember.
Okay. I like to pose the same question. What was your work relationship like with Raymond Benzino while you was at the Source?
See, Benzino and I had a different relationship when I was at the Source because he was my boss, but it was more like we would have more of the creative conversations, right? Like he used to be involved when I was the editor. He was involved in some of the decision making. So he was someone who, and I don't know before I got there how it went down, but like it got to a point in my career where at the Source where I would talk to Dave and be like, hey, we want to do this, so we want to put this on the cover, and he'd be like, go talk to Ray. You know what I mean? So like there was a lot of influence that he had when I was the editor.
Got it.
Yeah.
When did you leave? 2005?
I left. Are my glasses, I feel like they're like, do I look crazy with the glasses off?
You straight.
They're not like, okay. I left in March of 2005.
2005.
Yeah, I didn't just leave.
There was some duress. I like to touch on that briefly.
Okay.
In 2005, according to some of the research I did, you filed a lawsuit versus the Source Magazine.
I did.
Some of the grounds on the lawsuit was sexual harassment, sexual discrimination, retaliation, and defamation. Do you care to elaborate on why you filed a lawsuit at your former employer?
So I wrote a book. It's available on Amazon. I wrote this book, released it around 2008. It's called Straight from the Source. In that book, I really broke down my issues, that I had and the reasons why I filed a lawsuit against the magazine.
Yeah.
20 years later, I've told this story, a lot. So It's not that I don't want to talk about it. It's just that I just feel like it's rehashing everything that I've already said. You know what I mean? So ultimately, I would say I'm someone who stands up for themselves. And at the time, that was what I was feeling. I was wronged. Um, I was wrongfully terminated, and I filed a lawsuit.
Okay.
I broke my nail.
And what appeared to be, I guess, maybe some form of retaliation, Benzino accused you of extortion on the radio at some point. Do you care to elaborate?
I won a defamation claim because there were things that were said about me back then.
Right.
So I also had sued them for defamation, you know.
How well did the book do?
The book did well. The book did well.
Was it therapeutic writing that book?
Books are therapy. Like you don't write a book to, like, especially nowadays, to make a ton of money just by writing a book and selling the book. I remember a writer told me back then, get all the money that you can up front for your book because you'll never recoup. Mm. And I remember having conversations with other writers where it's kind of like a joke, right? Like no one ever sees anything in royalties. And that, obviously it's different for people who have written like big New York Times bestsellers, and not just New York Times bestsellers, because that's also something that I think is misunderstood, right? When you have like a Twilight book series, remember the Twilight series with the vampires and all that?
Absolutely.
That's like a phenomenon. So I'm sure she made millions and millions of dollars off of that series, right? The Game of Thrones books that you're making like millions of dollars. So many books come out, and even if they make the New York Times bestsellers list, it's not like you're making buku dollars off of the book. You really make your money. And I had a 6-figure book deal back then, and I remember my agent telling me that it was unheard of for someone who wasn't a celebrity to get a deal like that at that time. So I did well for the book, but it was like after putting out the book, hitting the speaking circuit, right? Making money, taking it to universities. Like when you put out a book, it's not just about getting your upfront money, getting your advance. It's really like about the marketing of the book and like where you take the book after and whether you're using it in academia. Like there's all these different things that I even learned by putting out that book back then, right? So to me, the book was a big success, right? Because I got a nice advance. I had a lot of awareness. I put the book out and I took it on the speaking circuit, and I went to universities across the country, and I talked about my experience. And as a woman who had a story like that at a time where people weren't speaking out. See, that's the thing. If you look at
When you say speaking out, I like to interject. What were your lectures predicated
your voice
on?
is going to be heard on this, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Because I'm like, how they gonna? I didn't know if I had. Okay. What was your question?
What was some of your lectures predicated on while you was running the speaking circuit?
So I have a different set of lectures when I speak with the book, right? Because I talk about an experience as a woman, right? I talk about women in hip hop. I talk about misogyny in hip hop. There's a lot of different topics that I can touch that the book was able to cover, right? For me, I actually frame the lectures when I go to different places to speak. So I have like a ton of lectures written out, right? Depending on what the school is looking for. Okay. And I think that, just kind of like having the book is like a base to start. When you have a book, you're going to get booked more, no pun intended, right? So having that book and writing that book at that time for me was a big career boost because I was able to then build from that, right? In the book, I didn't speak specifically about my experience in the court system, even.
Right.
right? Like that's something else that you can talk about. When you look at what's going on now with women speaking out, right? With women talking about their experiences or, discrimination, harassment, what they've been through, especially in the music industry. Now it's a lot of people are more open to hearing those stories from women. But in 2005, it was really unheard of. It was like, whoa, don't do that. Don't say anything. And a lot of people felt like, well, I mean, it is what it is. That's the experience. Like, that's what you got to deal with. So it's very early for me to be talking about those issues within the culture. So for me, it was hard because a lot of people turned their back on me, like, and they didn't want to deal with me based on the fact that I was like a whistleblower.
Right.
I was someone who was like, no, 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 this happened to me. And whatever the motivation for it, that was what it was. But in hindsight now, I'm able to look at it differently, and I'm able to be even more proud of what I did now than I was back then. Because back then I was intimidated. I didn't know if I was going to get a job after doing what I did and speaking out and writing a book and being able to talk about what I went through.
Right.
I had no idea how that was going to affect my career.
Right.
But now that I look at it, I'm like, that was what you needed to do, because it was so much of a learning experience for me as a woman and as someone who's been in this business for a long time.
Right. Being viewed as a whistleblower, did it impede any progress that you had after the Source?
Yeah, like nobody wanted to hire me at that time. It took a woman to come give me a job and hire me, and I ended up going to BET. But at that time, it was kind of like, well, wait a minute, because people didn't know how that case was going to pan out. So they didn't really understand why. A lot of people care too much about your motivation,
Right.
right? Because I was standing up for something that I believed in, something that I felt like was happening to me that I knew was against the law. But a lot of people are like, why is she doing it? Oh, she's only doing it because she got fired. Don't worry about why I'm doing it. I'm doing it now. That's the bottom line. Doesn't matter why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm doing it now. And either you on this side of things or you're on the other side of things. And I think a lot of people were conflicted because maybe they didn't agree with things that I had done when I was at the magazine, or there were some people maybe that didn't like me for whatever reasons they had, for whatever past history was going on. Like, it was hard to get behind what I was doing, especially if you looked at me like, well, I didn't really like her anyway, but then there were people who understood the bigger mission of what I was doing.
Got you. Let's say you reinvented yourself or you made your return to urban media. Was that when you went to television?
Well, I put my head down after that. Okay, so here's the thing. After I put on my book and I got a job, I had my kids.
Okay.
I got married, I had my kids. So like I put my head down. I didn't really want to be seen or deal with it. It was like a lot on me. So I was like, I'm good on that. I never needed to be out in the open and like, look at me, look at me. I never had that sense of me. So for me to go away for years was okay. I was still doing my thing behind the scenes. I was still getting money. I was still, connected to a lot of people in the business. So it was okay for me to not be out, as an editor in chief or out in front of everyone. And this was at a time where social media was still, still fairly new. So I was okay with not showing everybody what I was doing. So at the time, social media was coming up, right? Like people were just learning about Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whatever it is. Everybody was, on a daily basis, letting the world know what they were doing
Right.
in this space. And I was home. I would go to work. I would go home. I had some kids. I was taking care of my kids. Sometimes I would let people know how my kids were and how they were doing. But in this space, in the media space, although I was doing things, although I was still writing, although I was working, at BT Digital, at Global Grind, at all these different places that were really establishing themselves on a digital landscape, right, where it came to content. I was doing all that, but I wasn't doing it in front of the camera.
Gotcha.
So because I wasn't doing it in front of the camera, or I wasn't like writing an article and then posting it to everyone and saying like, I just did this article. And it was a time where I was writing 10 articles a day. I'll never forget this. It was a whole big thing. I'll never do it again. But I was writing 10 articles a day for BT based on some like behind the scenes business. That's what I was required to write in order to keep the money that I had coming in, because they started to quantify it differently.
Right.
But people didn't know, like I was like a machine. I was like interviewing people, interview, publish, because I didn't broadcast it, and I wasn't keeping people in the know of like, look at me, this is what I'm doing, right? I always felt like that time will come around again. And, you know, I think a few years ago, as I started to work more in the television space and people started to associate my name with certain shows that were hits, that's when people started to ask questions again about like, wait, oh, that's Kim from The Source. Like, but Kim from The Source was doing a lot all those years. I just wasn't telling everybody.
Right. Executive producer of Love and Hip Hop New York and Black Ink Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Explain to me the transition going from being a writer conventionally to stepping your game up to the TV networks.
So with television, right, it's interesting because I did a show. So I did the Gossip Game back in 2013. And that was around the time where I was still writing for online sites. I had gone back to the Source Magazine under Londell McMillan when he took the brand over. And so I was still a part of media. But again, remember I said I was having some kids. I was more so like involved with my kids and my marriage at the time. And I ended up doing that show, Gossip Game, which was on VH1.
Right.
But at the same time, one of the things that I had done, like while I was working at BET, was I had written for television. So I used to write like these live to tape shows. I would write, you know, when you see those countdown shows on the network.
Yeah.
I would write the countdown shows, right? Like I would script them.
The 10 most this and
and that's what we did at the Source, really. So I was scripting a lot of these shows while I was working at BET, and that's how I was getting my feet wet in television.
Got it.
So when I did the Gossip Game, I was transitioning, and that was at a time where reality TV was really, really like, it was already like successful, but Love and Hip Hop was just getting its footing, and
it was new.
But it was like the budgets were coming in crazy, and we were starting to recognize that the budgets for these shows were big. And so I wanted to write for those brands, knowing that that's where the money was coming from. So I started writing the reunion shows first. I started writing Love and Hip Hop Reunion season 3, I think. That might have been the first reunion show that I wrote. And I did the scripting for that. And in reality at the time, there was no line for a writer, right? There are very few shows that I was credited as a writer because of the union, right? Because a lot of unscripted, you know, we don't have union representation. So for me, when I started writing those shows, that was a way to transition to producer on the unscripted side. And then I started to do episodic. And that's when I'm trying to think of what the first show I did. Because I started working with a lot of production companies and I was writing, right? A lot of producers are writers, but you don't get the writing credit because there's different rules for writers. There's different pay scales for writers. So you go in as a producer, and that's when it gets complicated, because if you're a producer writer, it's a different creative than if you're doing, like if you're a producer and you're working directly with talent, or you're booking, or you're it's just different roles, but they're kind of all lumped under this producer title. Because a lot of producers handle a lot of logistics. And as a writer, I've learned that I'm less creative as a producer sometimes because I got to handle the logistics and I got to handle the budgets. That's not really the passion that I have. Like, my passion is for writing. So I went in on the episodic side as a writer, really.
Right.
But it was called a producer. And so from there, I worked myself up from that to showrunners. Most showrunners have the background in writing. And when you don't, it shows in your work. So a lot of showrunners have gotten promoted up that way, right? Like, I used to say on set when I was working on TV shows, I was never a PA, because a lot of people came up from that. Like, they started as a PA, and then they went to they became an AP, and then they went to producer, and then
When you say PA, is that producer associate?
that's production assistant.
Gotcha.
So a PA, will work on the set and do different things. Like, they're just kind of learning the set. But I used to say I was never a PA because I kind of came in on a supervising producer level, but as a writer.
Yeah.
When you get to that level and you start, kind of like racking up your TV credits, when you have enough, a lot of times when they're hiring, they assume that you have that creative background, but a lot of showrunners don't, right? Because a lot of show running is logistics, and they, the networks want to control creative. So it gets real fuzzy when you start talking about people who say, oh, I'm a showrunner, I'm a, this type of producer. But as a writer, I came up and started show running. And that's when I got like to the level of, like, I was doing Black Ink Chicago and the Love and Hip Hop season 10 and, those things. But really I came up, like, I did the Pink Teacup show, which was called Hustle and what was that? Hustle and Soul, right? We titled it Hustle and Soul. Like, I did, Hustle in Brooklyn, which was on BET. And I think, like, those type of shows really helped me to learn the logistics side of producing, and added with my writing. That's really where I started to beef up my credits in TV.
Yo, you know the vibes. Uncle Ralph McDaniels, Video Music Box, Lord Nez in the building.
Yeah, Queens get the money, baby. Shout out to Gully TV, man.
Gully TV.
How you say, get your dribble right?
Get your dribble right.
Get your dribble right?
Ah!
Yeah.
Yeah,